Why is Abraham Lincoln considered America's greatest president? Part 1. Introduction and Abraham Lincoln's background. Abraham Lincoln, the great emancipator of the United States, the greatest president in history, and the man who guided America through its darkest times. As the leader of the land of stars and stripes, he successfully abolished slavery and modernized the U.S. economy. Yet few people know that before becoming America's greatest president, Abraham Lincoln was once an ordinary hired worker, blending in among the masses. So, have you ever wondered how Lincoln, from being an anonymous laborer, managed to become America's greatest president, a man who changed the course of the United States history for centuries to come? Let's explore the journey and life of this great man. Speaking of the early years of a great figure, Abraham Lincoln was born on February 12, 1809, in Kentucky, USA. Perhaps most of us have heard of Lincoln as coming from an uneducated farming family, with his parents often described as struggling, a narrative used to highlight the hardships of this genius president. But the truth is quite different. His parents were small farm owners in Kentucky. While their business was not particularly prosperous, overall, the Lincoln family was not in dire poverty. Today, the farm is preserved as part of a national historic site, the birthplace of Abraham Lincoln. His father was not uneducated, as is often portrayed. In fact, he was even a member of the local jury, a group of respected citizens elected to adjudicate local disputes. Part 2. Family Tragedy and a Turning Point in Life. A major tragedy struck the Lincoln family. The entire family was targeted by a scheme, and his father was powerless against influential figures, resulting in the loss of all their family's possessions. After years of building their livelihood, everything came crashing down for him and his family, perhaps witnessing his father's helplessness in the face of those who twisted justice, shaped Lincoln, later forging him into a brilliant lawyer. After the family lost everything, Lincoln's life was filled with upheaval. Following the deaths of his mother and sister, along with multiple relocations due to war, he developed a deep aversion to conflict, a love for peace, and a profound empathy for the farming class. This greatly influenced his political career later on. At the age of 20, the upheavals of his early life drove young Lincoln to leave home in search of a new life, an opportunity to change his own destiny and that of his family. An ordinary man among ordinary men, as he described himself in his autobiography. A strange bottle, friendless, uneducated, penniless, stepping into the vast prairie world at night. Part 3. Early Career and Initial Failures. The future great president began his illustrious career from such a humble starting point, and the rest is history, of slavery and of all of America. Lincoln started his first entrepreneurial venture by buying a general store. However, it seemed business was not his forte. After struggling for a while, he incurred heavy losses, and ultimately, Lincoln was left empty-handed once again. Despite losing everything, failure did not deter him. Realizing business was not the right path, he embarked on a political career by running for the Illinois state legislature. This was likely the most important and correct decision of Lincoln's life. He may not have had exceptional business acumen, but this choice allowed Lincoln to discover an extraordinary talent within himself, his unparalleled oratory skills. A young man, still wet behind the ears, with no wealth, connections, or formal education, prioritized the local people, who were left in awe witnessing his soaring eloquence. Charismatic, passionate, and talented. These were qualities people had to acknowledge in Lincoln, despite his youth. The extensive social knowledge he gained from years of hardship helped him win the affection of his supporters. Part 4. Political Failures and Perseverance. But once again, as if fate were playing a cruel trick, Lincoln failed. The affection the people had for him did not align with how the ruling class viewed this young man. Lincoln did not win his first election. Failure in the election did not make him give up. To survive during that dark period, he took on various jobs, such as a postmaster in New Salem and a land surveyor. Throughout this time, he remained passionately devoted to studying classic legal texts. Heaven does not forsake the determined, and in 1834, Lincoln successfully became a lawyer and was elected to the state legislature. 2 years later, he joined the bar as a lawyer and moved to Illinois, establishing a solid position in politics. He tirelessly advocated for humanitarianism and demanded the abolition of slavery. However, his voice carried little weight, and his progressive proposals were largely ignored. Part 5. Political Career and Progressive Ideals. From the early 1830s, Lincoln was a steadfast member of the Whig Party, a party with progressive policies such as modernizing the economy and banking, using protective tariffs to fund domestic development like railroads, and supporting urbanization. In 1846, Lincoln was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives, serving a 2-year term among numerous distinguished candidates. Yet Lincoln still stood out. He was the only member of the Illinois delegation to be a Whig, representing a party with progressive ideals. Lincoln thrived like a fish in water. Upon being elected, he worked tirelessly to assert himself by expressing his party's stance in votes and speeches supporting its policies. Within a short time, with the backing of his party, Lincoln proposed a bill to abolish slavery in the District of Columbia. This was a monumental step in the history of the United States. However, the bill was not passed, as it severely impacted the interests of those in power. Part 6. Confronting Power and Temporary Retreat. Yet, Lincoln did not stop at being an ordinary party member. With a burning desire to reform America, Lincoln publicly criticized the sitting president at the time, James Polk, calling him a dictator and a useless man obsessed with military glory, a foolish delusion, when Polk fanatically pursued the war with Mexico. With sharp reasoning, Lincoln exposed Polk's lies, as the latter falsely propagated that Mexican soldiers were deliberately provoking the U.S. Lincoln demanded that the sitting U.S. president provide concrete evidence of a war prepared by Mexico. However, this demand was not approved by the U.S. Congress. The press also ignored it, and the matter gradually faded, but Lincoln had truly become a thorn in the side of those in power. Danger was lurking around him. How could he protect his life and continue on the political path? Lincoln was forced to publicly apologize to Polk. However, his political path had significantly narrowed. By the end of 1846, the Whig Party's presidential candidate failed to win, causing the party's standing to decline sharply. Amid the chaos of the times and the constant danger surrounding him, Lincoln decided to resign and return to being a lawyer. It seemed the life of this great man would return to its previous obscurity. But no, this temporary end to his political career was actually the beginning of a brilliant prairie lawyer in Springfield. Part 7. Legal Career and Far-Reaching Reputation. After successfully escaping the quagmire of politics with his talent, Lincoln turned this land into the fairest place for justice in all of America. With his abilities, Lincoln easily handled long-stalled disputes in the western regions. His reputation spread far and wide, earning him widespread acclaim. The name Abraham Lincoln once again appeared before the U.S. Supreme Court as he defended a case involving a steamboat accident due to a bridge collision, a matter in the field of law. Brilliant as he was, few know that he was also a formidable steamboat engineer. In 1849, he was granted a patent for a waterway device applied to navigating boats in shallow waters. Although this idea was never commercialized, Lincoln remains the only U.S. president to have ever been granted a patent. In total, during his time as a lawyer, Lincoln appeared before the Illinois Supreme Court in 175 cases, serving as the sole defense attorney in 51 of them, with 31 rulings in his favor. The people affectionately called him Honest Abe, the prairie lawyer, for his integrity and fairness, which earned him immense recognition. The day he returned to politics and wrote the golden pages of U.S. history was not far off. Part 8. fighting for slaves and returning to politics. Abraham Lincoln, a light at the end of the tunnel for enslaved people. Even during his days as a lawyer, the future president had deep empathy for slaves. Under Lincoln's influence, the legalization of slavery in the U.S. gradually lost its grip in the West. While this was of immense significance, it severely impacted those in power. So Lincoln faced countless difficulties in pursuing his dream of an equal society. In response to the rising momentum of the abolitionist movement, those in power passed the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. All of Lincoln's proposals seemed to hit a dead end. However, when one door closes, another opens. With a vision ahead of his time, Lincoln understood that to secure freedom for the voiceless, he had to become a voice in society, not just in a small state, but across all of America. This drove him to return to politics, collaborating with seasoned Senator Stephen Douglas, who would later become Lincoln's opponent in the presidential election. He managed to push through several progressive policies on slavery in the U.S., though Douglas proposed allowing local residents to decide whether to abolish slavery or not. When challenged by Lincoln, Douglas realized that agreeing with him would turn the legislation, which had taken 5 years of effort to pass, into the greatest farce in U.S. history. Racial discrimination in America was still extremely complex, even in the present day, let alone during that dark era. If the decision were left to the people, it was almost certain that white people would never accept living peacefully and equally with black people in all aspects. Some senators even viewed the advancement of black people as a sin, an insult to white people, pushing America back into an era of barbarism. Part 9. Founding the Republican Party and a Historic Speech. On October 16, 1854, in a speech in Peoria, Lincoln declared his anti-slavery stance, paving the way for his presidential candidacy. He represented the Whig Party in the U.S. Senate election. After leading in the first 6 rounds of voting in the Illinois legislature, support for Lincoln gradually weakened. To regain strong backing, Lincoln decided he needed to establish his own political party. With the achievements he had built, Lincoln successfully continued to lead members of his national party, built on the principles of democratic freedom. Thus, the Republican Party was born, marking a new chapter in U.S. history. At the 1856 Republican National Convention, Lincoln was the second contender in the race for the party's vice presidential nomination. Just a year later, Lincoln delivered his first speech that brought hope to enslaved people, stating that everyone is equal in skin color, physique, intellect, moral development, and social capacity. Dividing society into classes would inevitably lead to conflict and tear the nation apart. This speech served as a rallying cry to unite Republicans across the North. Part 10. Famous Debates and National Prominence. In 1858, the debates between Lincoln and Douglas took place during the campaign for the U.S. Senate. These were among the most famous political debates in U.S. history. Lincoln warned that slavery threatened the values of republicanism and accused Douglas of distorting the Founding Fathers' principle that all men are created equal. Meanwhile, Douglas emphasized the right of local residents to decide whether to accept slavery or not. The debates between the two were fiercely contested, but in the end, Douglas won, as he vigorously defended the interests of white people who held absolute sway in American society at the time. Once again, luck did not smile on Lincoln, despite years of tireless effort seemingly going to waste. However, with his oratory skills, he truly became a prominent figure in national politics. In early 1860, under the leadership of the New York Party, Lincoln delivered a speech at Cooper Union before an audience of influential Republican figures. Lincoln argued that the Founding Fathers were not particularly concerned with popular sovereignty, but consistently sought to curb slavery. He emphasized that the moral spirit of Republicans required them to oppose slavery and resist any temptation to adopt a neutral stance between right and wrong. Never before had anyone made such a profound impression. For the first time, rallying a New York audience, his display of intellectual leadership placed Lincoln among the top political figures in the party, paving the way for his effort to secure the party's presidential nomination. The presidential campaign of this genius was about to begin, with golden pages of history ready to be written. Enslaved people also began to see the light of their lives. Part 11. How Lincoln rose to the pinnacle of power, and how his reforms helped America overcome its darkest era. Carrying a burning desire for an equal society, Lincoln repeatedly proposed progressive laws to fight for the rights of enslaved people. However, in that dark era, the voice of a lowly man like him carried no weight. Alongside his speeches advocating for the enslaved, Lincoln gradually became a thorn in the side of those in power. Understanding the great threat to himself, he decided he had to become a strong figure, a voice of influence, to realize the noble ideals of his life, thereby writing glorious pages in the history of the United States. So, have you ever wondered how Lincoln managed to win the presidency, and how slavery in the U.S. was abolished? Let's explore this with Better Life right now. Part 12. The Race to the White House. After gaining fame with his iconic speeches and demonstrating his leadership abilities, Lincoln naturally received the support of the Republican Party. Amid the urging of the times, Lincoln understood that the opportunity to reach the pinnacle of glory had arrived. At the Republican State Convention held in Decatur on May 9 and 10, 1860, Lincoln received support to run for president. A week later, at the 1860 Republican National Convention in Chicago, in the third round of voting, Lincoln triumphantly secured the nomination. This was the first fruit of his tireless efforts on the political path. This achievement was thanks to his monumental contributions to the slavery issue and his moderate stance during a time of fierce partisan conflicts. His prior support for the party's domestic improvement programs also smoothed his path to some extent. It might seem that this was the most significant and easiest step in Lincoln's life, but the challenges for this man were only just beginning. Facing Lincoln in the race to the White House was his longtime rival, Stephen Douglas, who had defeated him in every prior election. Backed by the Democratic Party, Douglas was the greatest obstacle on Lincoln's path to the pinnacle of glory. Throughout the campaign, Lincoln did not deliver campaign speeches, even though his oratory skills were the very weapon that brought him back to politics. This was unprecedented in U.S. history. Why Lincoln refrained from campaign speeches remains an enduring mystery. However, during the campaign, he closely monitored the efforts and trusted in the enthusiasm of Republican Party members. In areas with loyal party members, they did everything possible to bring Lincoln's image to the public. They traveled extensively and formed majority groups across the North, printing and distributing a series of flyers and writing numerous editorials in newspapers. Around 2,000 Republican speakers promoted the party's platform and Lincoln's life experiences, emphasizing his impoverished childhood. This is also why we often hear about Lincoln's extremely difficult background for many years afterward, even though he was actually born and raised in a relatively well-off family. All these tactics had one sole purpose: to showcase the superior power of free labor. What could be more wonderful than the free labor policies pursued by the Republican Party being embodied in their own candidate? The journey from the mud of the era, through intellect, passion, and especially free labor, as portrayed by the Republican Party, truly touched the hearts of the American people. A writer from the Chicago Tribune wrote an essay detailing Lincoln's life, selling between 100,000 and 200,000 copies in a short time. At times, newspapers sold out before the official articles were even published, guiding public opinion. Thanks to this effective promotion, the Republican Party's reputation echoed throughout the nation. Opposing parties and Lincoln's rivals were severely weakened. Lincoln became the brightest candidate to lead the White House in the upcoming term. On November 6, 1860, Lincoln overcame a host of formidable opponents, including Stephen Douglas of the Democratic Party, John Breckinridge of the Southern Democratic Party, and John Bell of the Constitutional Union Party to win the election and become the 16th President of the United States. Lincoln received 1,866,452 votes, while Douglas had 1,376,957, Breckinridge 848,781, and Bell 588,089. With an overwhelming number of votes, Lincoln ascended to the pinnacle of glory. However, his victory was primarily based on votes from the North and West. The day he was declared the winner was also the day the first undercurrents of unrest emerged. America was preparing for the greatest upheaval in its history, and the challenges for Lincoln had truly begun. Part 13. The American Civil War. As the election results became clear, secessionists openly declared their intent to break away from the Union. Before Lincoln took office, on December 20, 1860, South Carolina led the way by passing an ordinance of secession. On February 1, 1861, Florida, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas, 6 of these states, adopted a constitution and declared themselves a sovereign nation, forming the Confederate States of America. The states of Delaware, Maryland, Missouri, and Kentucky listened, but refused to join the secession. Both the sitting president at the time, James Buchanan, and President-elect Lincoln refused to recognize the Confederacy, declaring the secession illegal. On February 9, 1861, the Confederacy chose Jefferson Davis as its president. Tensions escalated to the extreme, but in the initial moves, both sides still sought reconciliation efforts. The Confederacy, armed with guns, proposed terms from earlier compromises, suggesting a division into free and slave regions. This went against the entire vision of an equal society where white and black people could live in peace, which the Republican Party and Lincoln were pursuing. Faced with the Confederacy's uncooperative attitude, Lincoln boldly declared, "I would rather die than accept any concession or compromise that would allow me to possess this government, which we have obtained through constitutional rights." However, Lincoln still hoped to resolve the secession through peaceful efforts by protecting slavery in states where it already existed. But the Confederacy had no intention of further compromise. They wanted to establish slavery across all of America. And what they did next truly pushed Lincoln and the Republican Party to their limits. Just weeks before the inauguration, Lincoln went as far as writing a letter to all governors, urging them to support a law that would limit slavery to areas where it already existed, rather than the entire U.S. This was seen as the president-elect's final effort to save America from a civil war. However, he was targeted for assassination, but narrowly escaped death when a bodyguard took a bullet for him. This was the straw that broke the camel's back, plunging America into an unprecedented crisis on multiple fronts: economic, political, and military, a true test for the young administration of President Lincoln. On April 12, 1861, when Southern forces attacked a federal military base at Fort Sumter in South Carolina, the American Civil War officially began. Fort Sumter quickly fell, and the Lincoln administration was stunned, as they had not expected the Confederacy to strike so swiftly. Just 3 days later, Lincoln called on the states to provide 75,000 troops to recapture the forts, protect Washington, and preserve the existence of the United States. However, all of Lincoln's peaceful efforts went down the drain, as Southern states continued to declare secession in rapid succession. America was divided into fragments, and war had truly broken out. Though he did not want to take up arms against his fellow countrymen in such chaotic times, it is the defeated who become heroes, and Lincoln had to resolve the unrest through force. After the fall of Fort Sumter, Lincoln recognized the importance of directly taking command to control the war and establish a comprehensive strategy to suppress the rebellion. Facing an unprecedented political and military crisis, Lincoln, as commander-in-chief, wielded unprecedented powers. He expanded wartime executive powers, imposed a blockade on all Confederate ports, and ordered the imprisonment without trial of thousands suspected of supporting the Confederacy. Congress and Northern public opinion supported him even more. Lincoln had to struggle to consolidate strong support from slave states in the border regions and prevent the war from escalating into an international conflict. However, Democratic Party leaders criticized the Civil War as being caused by Lincoln's refusal to compromise on slavery with the Southern states. Meanwhile, the radical wing of the Republican Party accused him of being too weak for delaying decisions on abolishing slavery. With both parties turning against him, Lincoln bore the brunt of the entire nation's fate. Yet, instead of becoming a tragic hero crushed by extreme pressure, Lincoln calmly led the military to victory, gradually turning the historic war in America into a springboard to revive the land of stars and stripes. With the help of renowned generals, Lincoln gradually subdued the Confederacy. The tide of the war, initially favoring the Southern Army, began to turn. In 1862, the President's army crossed the Potomac River, advanced into Maryland, and clashed with the Confederates in the Battle of Antietam, creating the bloodiest battle in U.S. history. This battle completely shifted the strategic balance and laid the foundation for Lincoln to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. Part 14. The Emancipation Proclamation. As the Civil War turned in his favor, Lincoln understood that the federal government's power to emancipate slaves was a constitutional mechanism, as the Constitution prior to 1865 had reserved this right to the states. At the start of the war, Lincoln tried to persuade states to accept compensated emancipation, but only Washington agreed. Thus, in this reform, he rejected proposals to limit emancipation geographically. On June 19, 1862, with Lincoln's support, Congress passed a law banning slavery across all federal territories. In July, a second law was passed, establishing judicial procedures to emancipate the slaves of convicted Confederate supporters. Though he did not believe Congress had the authority to emancipate slaves within state territories, Lincoln approved the bill to express his support for the legislative branch. As Commander-in-Chief, Lincoln understood that he could fully use his authority to pass laws to emancipate slaves immediately. However, after discussing the contents of the proclamation with his cabinet, Lincoln viewed the Emancipation Proclamation as a necessary and appropriate military measure, declaring that all individuals considered slaves in the seceded states would be free from that day forward and forever. On September 22, 1862, the Emancipation Proclamation was officially issued. Lincoln's lifelong dream became a reality, and from then on, the United States would be a land of peace, where all ethnicities could live in harmony. Effective January 1, 1863, the proclamation took effect nationwide, receiving support from enslaved people across the country. As the Federal Army advanced deeper into the South, more slaves were freed, until over 3 million slaves in Confederate territory were emancipated. Perhaps the decision to issue the Emancipation Proclamation was the wisest of Lincoln's life, ushering America into a new era, an era of equality and development. We have explored Lincoln's efforts to reach the pinnacle of glory. U.S. history officially turned a new page after the Emancipation Proclamation. However, America was still in the midst of war and a dark historical period. So, how did the great President Lincoln reform America? Part 15. The End of the American Civil War. The Emancipation Proclamation opened golden pages in U.S. history, while propelling Lincoln to the pinnacle of glory. However, despite all slaves theoretically being forever free, the Civil War had not yet ended. The black hole of the era continued to drag the United States deeper into chaos. At the crossroads of the age, America awaited its president to make decisions to pull the nation out of crisis. A major reform was about to take place, and the spring called the United States of America, compressed to its limit, was ready to leap forward for centuries. So how did the American Civil War ultimately end, and how was America reformed under President Lincoln's leadership? In July 1863, the Army of the Potomac under General Smith achieved a major victory at the Battle of Gettysburg, marking the most significant turning point in the Civil War, completely breaking the Confederacy's offensive efforts. The Federal Army, under Lincoln's direction, gained enormous influence across the United States. In politics, Lincoln also received strong support within his party, solidifying his political position. Everything went smoothly for Lincoln, especially after his speech at the Gettysburg Cemetery on Thursday afternoon, November 19, 1863, at the National Soldiers' Cemetery in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. The ceremony to dedicate the soldiers who died in the Civil War was held solemnly, with Lincoln stepping up to the podium. With just 271 words in a 3-minute address, Lincoln emphasized that the nation was not born in 1789, but in 1776, conceived in liberty, and dedicated to the belief that all men are created equal. America was born the day the Declaration of Independence was proclaimed, when the 13 colonies broke free from British enslavement, and the essence of America remains independence and freedom. Now, to pull America out of the abyss of the era and achieve great development, the only path was to build a democratic and free order. Lincoln believed the war was a sacrifice in the struggle for the principles of freedom and equality for all, and emancipating slaves was part of that effort. He declared that the deaths of brave soldiers were not in vain, that slavery would fail, and that the future of democracy would be assured, and a government of the people, by the people, for the people would not perish from the earth. Lincoln concluded that the Civil War had a noble purpose, giving birth to a new era of freedom for the nation. His resolute words that day went down in history, becoming the most precious evidence for many future presidents. Lincoln's powerful speech, penned by his own hand, inspired enslaved people to courageously rise against oppression. The army under his command accelerated its offensive, while the Southern Army faced increasing difficulties. The final days of the American Civil War were drawing near. After that history-changing memorial ceremony, Lincoln's army inflicted heavy damage on the Southern Army under General Lee's leadership through the Appomattox-Richmond campaign of attrition. Lacking abundant resources, Lee's army dwindled with each battle, while the Federal Army grew stronger under Lincoln's direction. The Confederacy's infrastructure, plantations, railroads, bridges, was mercilessly destroyed, directly impacting economic development and cutting off the abundant supply lines of Lee's army. The Confederate Army was thrown into utter panic, and General Lee, without a solid rear, gradually lost direction. Lincoln's elite army confidently advanced southward, penetrating deep into the Confederate defenses. On April 1, 1865, a major battle erupted between the Federal and Confederate armies. Ultimately, victory in this great battle belonged to the Federal Army under Lincoln's command. The Confederate government completely collapsed, forced to evacuate. From Lincoln's side, visiting the fallen Confederate capital, freed black people welcomed him as a hero, while white people seemed cold toward their president. The victory on April 9, 1865, at Appomattox Courthouse, where General Lee surrendered to the Federal Army, marked the end of the historic American Civil War. Lincoln's era of Reconstruction officially began. Part 16. The Reconstruction of the United States. With the achievements earned during the Civil War, Lincoln's prestige within his party grew ever higher. As a seasoned politician, Lincoln not only had the ability to unite all factions within the Republican Party, but also managed to win over many Democratic Party members, enabling bold moves. He spent many hours each week conversing with politicians from across the country, using his vast influence to build consensus among party factions, garner support for his policies, and counter efforts by the opposition plotting to push him into the abyss. Nearly a year before the Civil War ended, at the 1864 Party Convention, Andrew Johnson was chosen to run alongside Lincoln. Learning from the less than smooth first election, which was one of the causes of the Civil War, Lincoln knew that Republican Party support alone was not enough. To expand his political coalition and attract both Democratic and Republican members, Lincoln ran under the banner of the newly formed National Union Party. As he predicted, shortly after this decision, Lincoln's foundation was severely shaken, as his army suffered repeated defeats. At a time when the entire nation thought their president could not be re-elected, a Democratic general stepped in to support Lincoln, receiving abundant aid from those who had sworn enmity against him. Lincoln's army won consecutive victories, and his influence was once again established across the United States. He won a landslide victory in the election, once again becoming the leader of the White House. On March 4, 1865, President Lincoln officially began his second term with a speech on human rights and freedom that went down in history. A formal Reconstruction began. By the time Lincoln was re-elected, the Civil War was nearing its end. Through progressive methods of the time, he and his associates brought light and hope to enslave people lost in the South, allowing Lincoln's army to liberate them entirely and reintegrate. Slavery was abolished, and Americans could begin to dream of a unified nation and an equal society. After General Lee and the Confederate Army surrendered, Lincoln showed immense compassion. With all his heart, he was ready to spare those who had caused so much suffering in America. In Lincoln's eyes, these people were more pitiful than blameworthy, merely lost souls in the black hole of the era, unable to find a way out. Part 17. Aspiration for Peace and Reform. Carrying a burning desire for a unified America, the greatest president in history tirelessly pushed for a peaceful election. His proclamations of amnesty for Southern Army generals were repeatedly issued as a testament to Lincoln's ideals. Under the influence of the Emancipation Proclamation, across the majority of U.S. territory, Lincoln increased pressure, demanding Congress pass an amendment to outlaw slavery nationwide. Lincoln declared that such an amendment would resolve the issue once and for all, laying the foundation for America to leap out of the abyss of the era. Finally, through tireless efforts, the day Lincoln had long awaited arrived. On December 6, 1865, Lincoln's lifelong dream came true as the amendment was passed, becoming the 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. U.S. history officially turned a new page. Lincoln's peace efforts bore fruit, and the economy, agriculture, and industry gradually regained their footing across the United States. The National Banking Act allowed the establishment of a national banking system, providing an abundant financial network and establishing a national currency. With ambitions for a multi-component economy, the government encouraged selling land to citizens at low prices to promote development, though of course, all citizen development was calculated and controlled by the government in a planned manner. Public education was greatly emphasized, and sprawling railroad networks connecting the vast United States flourished, turning America into a literal global workshop. The states that had previously seceded gradually reintegrated with the U.S. The United States of America was once again unified and expanded in that miraculous development, with the greatest credit undoubtedly belonging to President Lincoln, the hero of emancipation, the man who rallied the entire American people, leading the nation step by step on the path to world dominance. Part 18. The Death of Abraham Lincoln, America's Pain. John Wilkes Booth, the perpetrator of the worst assassination in U.S. history, was a renowned actor, but in reality, a Confederate spy. Though not listed as a criminal among Confederate spies, he had close ties with factions unwilling to surrender or compromise after the Civil War ended. In 1864, Booth planned to kidnap Lincoln to demand the release of Confederate soldiers. But after hearing Lincoln's speech on April 11, 1865, Booth, enraged, changed his plan and decided to assassinate the president. Knowing that the president and his wife would attend Ford's Theater to celebrate the victory with senior generals, Booth devised a plan to assassinate Vice President Andrew Johnson, Secretary of State William Seward, and General Grant. On April 14, Lincoln attended the play Our American Cousin without bodyguards, as at the last minute, General Grant went to Philadelphia instead of attending the play. Seizing the opportunity, with the president seated in the honorary box without guards, around 10 p.m., Booth sneaked in and shot Lincoln in the back of the head. Major Henry Rathbone tried to intervene, but the assassin stabbed him and escaped. After 10 days on the run, Booth was found at a farm in Virginia, about 30 miles south of Washington, D.C. on April 26, after a brief confrontation. Federal soldiers killed Booth. As for Lincoln, after being shot in the head, he fell into a coma. After a 9-hour coma, Lincoln passed away at 7:22 a.m. on April 15. Lincoln's body was draped in the national flag and escorted by federal officers, amid rain, back to the White House, accompanied by the tolling of city church bells. Vice President Johnson was sworn in as president at 10 a.m. on the day of the assassination. For 3 weeks, a funeral train carried Lincoln's body through cities across the North, with memorial services attended by hundreds of thousands to honor the man who penned the golden pages of U.S. history, laying the foundation for a United States that would develop for years to come and forever. A lifetime devoted to the nation, the people, and the enslaved, now he had fallen. The tales of this genius's life will forever belong to history, leaving an indelible mark on the golden pages of U.S. and world history. He is honored as America's greatest president, and his life and career have become legendary. What are your thoughts on the life of this genius? Was Lincoln truly a virtuous and talented figure, or merely a man who rose through political machinations? Please share your opinions and let's discuss. Thank you for watching the video.